Welcome to the 11th talk, but the second part of it, 11b, which is about science and the development of science in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. The development of science is another one of those great pivot points of history. And it is interesting to note how it starts, certainly in England. And I'm going to just put up a little PowerPoint just to illustrate my talk as I go along. It was the work of Professor Peter Harrison from Cambridge that opened up the truth that the early English scientists of the 17th century definitely believed in a literal addendum. And their science, as it were, was born out of that belief. And this is actually quite interesting because it's not what you would have expected. And their worldview, as we shall see, assumed that there was a literal addendum. And this is the words of Francis Bacon, often considered the father of science, who set out the scientific method. And I think they illustrate an important point. So this is the book, The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science. And this is page 139. And this is Francis Bacon speaking. For man, by the fall, fell at the same time from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses, however, can even in this life be in some. The former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and sciences. For creation was not by the curse made altogether and forever a rebel, but in virtue of that charter, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. It is now by various labours, not certainly by disputations or idle magical ceremonies, but by various labours, at length, and in some measure, subdued to the supplying of man with bread, that is, to the uses of human life. And what Bacon is advancing is the notion that if you're going to find out knowledge, it won't be by idle debates, as the philosophers would have you think, or by magic, but by labour, by application, and by experimentation, and for this to be done in a collegiate fashion and to be reviewed as such, and with no grand plan that this should be incredibly successful, but success will be one often small step at a time in an accumulation of knowledge. And you can see this is actually a very humble approach to science. And it sees science as a labor-intensive industry involving lots of people, lots of repeated experiments, and with not expecting to find the secrets and mysteries of the universe overnight, but a little bit more information, a little bit knowledge, one step at a time. And this is how Peter Harrison sums it up. For the experimental philosophers, guided by the Baconian vision of science as the gradual accumulation of historical or experimental reports, science was to be a long-term and probabilistic enterprise. Their more restricted vision of the prospects of science was based in turn on a more sober appraisal of post-lapsarian minds and senses. Post-lapsarian is a technical term for after the fall of Adam. Experimental philosophy, which will be the subject of the next two chapters, sought the slow recovery of Adamic knowledge, but with an acute awareness that human investigators no longer possessed the perfect faculties of their first father. That type of approach to science, I think, was a very wise approach and one that could have borne much fruit. However, in the 18th century, that approach was set aside for a almost worship of rationalism, which we might call the Enlightenment. And embedded in that rationalism was a belief that if God existed, he was a God who set about the first cause, but no more. He was, as it were, a clockmaker who, once making the clock, left it to its own devices. And this led to an assumption, what you might call, in modern parlance, of methodological naturalism. That is, we live in a closed universe which does not have outside agencies acting upon it. And in that sort of debate, there was a profound skepticism towards the possibility of miracles. One of the great exponents of that position was David Hume, but he wasn't the only one. This, by the way, I could have mentioned was at the front piece of Francis Bacon's work. It says from Daniel that knowledge shall increase and many shall run to and fro. And I think it's fair to say that the 17th century scientists saw themselves as part of that prophetic vision, that historicist vision, I should say, that they'd reached the last days, and science was, in a sense, one of those facets of the last days. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in our next and final talk. However, back to my man, David Hume. Hume said this on miracles. For example, with regard to the case of the testimony to a resurrection, Hume would argue if the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. Effectively, what Hume was saying was that, in fact, I personally think that the resurrection of a body from the dead is so unlikely that it's more probable that the person telling me this is telling me a falsehood. Either they have misread the situation or they're telling me a lie. And that the probability of that is far higher than the probability of a miracle of the resurrection taking place. And so Hume basically said that it would be stretching credulity to believe that a miracle had taken place, and that he was under no obligation to believe that such thing had happened. Now, it's fair to say that things like Hume's argument still dominate philosophy today, especially in the Western world. And if you were to look up the Stanford Encyclopedia on the subject of miracles, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the subject of miracles, you would see that Hume commands a large portion of that particular article. But does his argument really merit that much recognition and that much honor? Well, more recent philosophers have questioned that. John Ehrman wrote a book, Hume's Abject Failure, and he argues quite strongly that really we should not be giving Hume the credit for this argument because it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that if you have multiple witnesses to an event, then it becomes highly improbable that multiple witnesses would actually all be lying or all be seeing things incorrectly. And in this, he quotes the work of Charles Babbage back in the 19th century. And in truth, had philosophers bothered to do their research, even in the 18th century, these arguments were being made. I shall read this out now. To make his point, Ehrman quotes Charles Babbage, the inventor of computers, if you might think about it, in his article on miracles in the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise, where Babbage makes the following observation. The probability of the falsehood of a fact, which has 6 such independent witnesses attest, is in the round numbers 1,000,000 million. or 1,000 billion to 1 against its occurrence, assuming the witnesses speak the truth and are not being deceived in 99 cases out of 100. Babbage then remarks that Hume had previously concluded that the improbability of a dead man rising restored to life was approximately 200,000 million to 1 against its occurrence. Therefore, it follows that the chances of accidental or other independent concurrence of only 6 such independent witnesses is already 5 times as great as the improbability against the miracle of a dead man being restored to life, deduced from Hume's method of estimating probability. Well, I think the point being made by Babbage is that, Hume, if I have 6 witnesses, I meet the criteria that you have set. And it is very likely that many of the miracles that have taken place in our current age have more than 6 such independent witnesses. As Babbage states in his 9th Bridgewater Treatise, if independent witnesses can be found who speak the truth more frequently than falsehood, it is always possible to assign a number of independent witnesses, the improbability of the falsehood of whose concurring testimony shall be greater than that of the improbability of the miracle itself. That is a far more reasonable presentation of the issue than the following more dogmatic statement made by Hume. There is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves. I would suggest that Hume was not arguing from a philosophical position or from a probabilistic position. He was just stating a prejudice. He didn't believe miracles took place, and he wasn't going to budge his position. I'm not sure such a dogmatic and basically prejudiced position should command the authority that it does, especially considering the work of Craig Keener that I've alluded to before, that definitely shows that there are many, many millions of people who claim to have observed miracles. Now, I was going to have a quick look at this, because in many ways the problem that we see in Hume, you might say, is the problem of someone who has lived in Scotland in the 18th century, where there isn't an awful lot of experience of miraculous things taking place. However, that is not the experience of everybody. Danny McCain, a Western professor who spent more than 2 decades teaching in Nigeria, notes that nearly all African Christians and most African theologians, regardless of their views on other critical issues, reject Western anti-supernaturalism. He acknowledges the existence of some false claims, but complains that it is arrogant and unprofessional for Western scholars to outright reject the miraculous, totally ignoring the testimonies of thousands of people, based simply on their own lack of such experiences. Hume is speaking from a very limited experiential position, and it is arrogant of people in the West to say miracles do not happen just because they've not experienced them. As Keener states, for those countries alone, and for Pentecostals and Charismatics in those countries alone, the estimated total of people claiming to have witnessed divine healings comes out to somewhere around 200 million. That's just for Pentecostals. So not only do we have the situation where we have probably many miracles that have over 6 independent witnesses, But we also have the probability of many miracles which have taken place. And there are potentially 200 million people who have witnessed them. The logic in that situation is miracles take place. And if we live in a world in which miracles take place, we do not live in a world in which methodological naturalism should be the guiding principle for every aspect of science, particularly those aspects of science where we believe a miracle has taken place. And there are two aspects of science where there's good reason to believe that miracles have taken place that are pertinent to the science that we study. One is the creation. That was a miraculous event, and therefore scientists need to factor that in when considering the probabilities of whether the recent creation is a valid scientific explanation. The second case of a miracle, which should be factored in, is the worldwide flood, because that would have laid down the rocks. Now, it is that problem that leads me to my final point. And that's the work of Terry Mortensen, The Great Turning Point. In the light of this anti-supernaturalism that existed towards the end of the 18th century, as the science of geology, or the study of rocks, becomes, in a sense, advanced and becomes something that can be studied at university as a discipline, this is brought about primarily with the building of canals and other such large-scale projects which showed the structure of the earth under the soil. There was, in a sense, every likelihood that the outcome would be one that would end up being an old age. Because if you don't believe in miracles, you're not going to believe in a flood. And therefore, if you're not going to believe in a flood, you're going to inevitably adopt the uniformitarian approach of Hutton and Lyell, which says that the present is the key to the past and avoids all reference to catastrophes. And so in the 1820s and 1830s, when geology was becoming solidified as a subject and becoming a university subject with professors, there really was only one show in town, and that was the uniformitarian show. The scriptural geologists of the time, and there were a number, were basically ignored and not respected. And as a consequence, their ability to influence the debate was not listened to, even though they had very powerful arguments, and they could show the polystrate fossils that I mentioned in talk 2, where you had tree trunks, fossilized tree trunks going through layers of rock, including many coal layers, which were supposed to be millions of years apart. They could show the evidence of all the river valleys, no matter how small, arriving at the same level, which suggested they must have been laid down all at the same time rather than differentially over millions of years. They could show that the cliff formations suggested that these cliffs had only been eroded over a few thousand years and not over millions of years. And there were many arguments that the scriptural geologists put forward to say that it was inconceivable that these formations were millions of years old. Unfortunately, they were not respected, nor were they listened to. And this is what Mortensen has to say. He says that having suggested that some probable reasons for the sudden rise of scriptural geologists, the following seem to be some of the reasons for their abrupt decline. From at least the 1810s, the control of the most influential scientific and educational institutions and scientific journals was held either by liberal Christians or moderate evangelicals, and as the century progressed, by men who were subtly or openly hostile to Christianity altogether. This inhibited the development of a new generation of geologically competent scriptural geologists. Closely related to this was the fact that in the 1830s and 40s, geology was rapidly changing from a gentleman's avocation into a specialized profession. This specialization made full-time geologists sensitive to what they perceived as intrusions into their private domains by part-time geologists, such as some of the scriptural geologists. So the professionalization of geology and the lack of a community in the church to support scriptural geologists starved them of new talent and isolated those that existed. So that by 1840s, there was hardly any scriptural geologists left writing who could contest the old age vision of the geology departments that were being established in the universities. And in a sense, the rest is history, because in 1859, Charles Darwin writes his book, The Origin of Species. He himself has been influenced by the work of Lyell. And though the theory of evolution had many scientists who doubted whether it was valid, all those scientists would have accepted the Earth was millions of years old. And therefore, it was inevitable some form of evolutionary theory was going to come along and make itself scientifically respectable. So I would say that the most important scientific change in this period wasn't necessarily the theory of evolution, but it was the concept of millions of years for the rocks. And it wasn't until 1961, with the publication of the book The Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris, did a serious alternative view to the formation of the rocks arrive on our doorsteps, as it were. And it's really since that time that the creation societies have functioned and have grown in confidence and in scientific rigor to a place where I believe in 2020, they present a very strong scientific case for a worldwide flood and a recent creation. And that really was the object of the first 5 of my talks. And my next talk will be about the 20th and 21st century and looking at the ways in which events in those centuries really speak of things that are predicted in the Bible. Great and momentous events, great changes, and things that I believe the Bible can speak to. Thank you for listening. And again, I'll try and close this down.